I want to greet you all from Warsaw. I'm right now in Warsaw. We had a conference here on memory politics, different memory politics in different countries of Eastern Europe, a very interesting conference that is already ended. And I stayed because today in the afternoon, I will have another conference with our Polish friends on problems of rule of law, questions of rule of law, and the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. But I'm really happy. It's a very special day today, the Human Rights Day of the United Nations, and I'm really happy to be here with you. And I want also to greet you from my colleagues from the conference. I think you know Adam Bodnar and some others probably as well. So I told them that we are going to meet online today. So the topic for today, Russian civil society in times of crisis, a view from outside. Well, from outside, it's sad to say, but for us, it's right now not possible to have a view from inside because we cannot just travel freely in and out. So I stress that it's a view from outside and you might see it completely different. But this view is based on my report that I wrote for the OSCE in this during the summer, and which I handed in September and which was adopted. There were 78 states of the OSCE who had demanded this report. So let me start with the date, the 7th October 2022. That was the date when the Peace Nobel Prize was given to three winners. And the first one was Memorial, as you all know, a Russian NGO. The second one was the Center for Civil Liberties and Alexandra Matveychuk, so a Ukrainian NGO. And the third one was Aleś Bialiatski, an NGO for the NGO Viesna. It's an NGO from Belarus, which supports political prisoners and their families. So when this decision of the Nobel Prize Committee was announced, the official reaction from the Ukrainian side was not at all that they were pleased. They criticized this decision a lot. And let me just quote the speaker of the president, Mikhailo Podolyak, who said the Norwegian Nobel Prize Committee had a strange understanding of peace when it gave representatives of two countries that had attacked a third one the Nobel Prize. So they criticized that neither the Russian nor the Belarusian opposition had been able to organize resistance against the war. And so there was no reason to congratulate on this Nobel Peace Prize. I think this comment from the Ukrainian side is understandable, but I think it's wrong. It's understandable first because, as I see it, the Ukrainians are afraid of being sort of taken together with other Eastern Europeans, and they want to be different. They don't want to be just united in some way by this decision. The second reason, in my view, is that they want to be seen as the, in inverted commas, real victims, and they don't want other victims like the Belarusian and the Russian civil society on the same level as they are. They see their victimhood in a different manner. And third, they are not, as they said, they are not impressed by the achievements of the Russian and Belarusian NGOs. They say it's not sufficient to be active and to do something, but you have to achieve something. And if you don't achieve something, and if you are not effective, That's not enough. But I think this attitude is, as I say, is wrong, because in my view, the Russian and the Belarusian NGOs like Memorial, they are also they also are worth getting this Nobel Peace Prize. And well, being here now in Warsaw today, they also celebrate a lot of heroes, like for the uprising in the Second World War, that was not successful. So only to measure the success and the effect in the end is, I think, not enough. But we have to see that human rights and the work on human rights by NGOs was not, and there it's true, was not effective enough to avoid happening what has happened, to avoid a renewal of hostility, of military force being used between those who were under the roof of the Council of Europe together. And so there are two questions I want to ask today. One question is, why was the Russian civil society not successful in preventing from happening what has happened? And second, why was the international community not successful in preventing from happening what has happened? So why was the Russian civil society not successful in preventing the downsliding towards what we might call an unfree society, not able to stop aggression against a neighbor country? I think we have to look at what has happened within the last 30 years. We cannot just regard the last years, but we have to have a holistic perspective. And so I would divide the period into five, actually these 30 years, into 5 different periods. The first one from 1991 to 2000. The second one, 2000 to 2008. The break being the war against Georgia, then 2008 until 2014, 2014 until 2022, and 2022 until nowadays. And I think when we look at the NGO and the civil society, we had in the 1990s, we had a blossoming period of NGOs when that was something new, and NGOs were founded and were active and were developing their programs and were interacting with the international society and were linked very much within Europe and within the world as a whole. From 2000 to 2008 and 2008 until 2014, these 2 periods I can take together for the NGO development, I think they were well functioning, they were active, they had an important say in the society. Probably they were also influential to a certain extent, and the international network was very intense. 2014, or perhaps already before, it seems to me, looking at the Russian legislation, the legislation on foreign agents, but also on other legislation, I think that the state started to act against its own civil society and made it more and more difficult and more dangerous for people to be active in civil society. Civil society, nevertheless, did not give up, but continued, but under difficulty that became more and more significant. And well, now starting from 2022 and the future, I don't know in how far civil society will have the possibility to continue to really have a say in what is happening. So now let us look on what has happened in those years. I think what we can and what's coming to this question: why has the Russian civil society that has been active and successful for 2 decades or for at least 15 years, why couldn't it be effective to prevent what has happened? And so I want to, what I see, you may have a different view, but what I see is on the one hand a fortification of the what you call vertical vlasti, and sort of giving up the model of a real separation of powers, which makes it more difficult for the civil society to survive. Second, what I also see is that there were many really well-structured and effective human rights institutions that couldn't continue their work after some point in time. And the third point is the legislation concerning civil society. And the fourth point are measures that we could call oppressive. And all that was what civil society was confronted. So first, this building up of vertical vlasti, I think my appreciation is that nowadays the power is really concentrated in the state, and especially the executive power. There is no subdivision of executive power and no separation of power otherwise as well. All the executive organs are basically built in this vertical vlasti that applies for federal security services and all those National Guard, all those institutions, and also for what you call the power ministry. They are all in this structure. And as I understand it, not only central, but also in the regions. So for me, in my interpretation, actually, one of the decisive turning points was quite early, and that was the abolishment of the elections of the governors. I think it was in 2002 or 2003, because the governors formed the Federative Council, and the Federative Council was very influential. And when the governors were no longer elected by the people, but selected and appointed by the president, this counterweight was no longer there. And I think that was the first point when the Constitutional Court didn't declare that unconstitutional, that the whole process of concentration of power could go on and start. So what could have been the reaction of civil society to these developments? To be honest, I think that civil society couldn't do anything about that. That's out of the scope of where civil society can really have an active influence so that it would not happen. The second part, what I observe is the human rights institutions and the civil society institutions that we had and have in Russia. There are quite a lot, and they are often built on what we know in other countries. So there is a constitutional court, there is an ombudsman, there is a presidential council for the development of civil society and human rights. There are separate public committees for supervision committees for prisons. So these are very promising and very good institutions. And the question is, where are they? What has happened with them? Are they able to support civil society? And there, well, when we look at the Constitutional Court, it didn't stop the law on foreign agents, and the small amendments it sometimes demanded were not implemented, and we see that the Constitutional Court is no counterweight to help civil society. So what has happened? We have a lot of new rules for the Constitutional Court. So we had changes concerning the functioning of the court, the procedure, and we had, even on the constitutional level, just one example, as I have seen, dissenting opinions were abolished, but even judges who were dissenting were no longer allowed to speak about their different approach. So this is, as I understood it, it's an extra limitation of freedom of expression for judges. And that obviously all these new rules and have blocked the functioning of the Constitutional Court. We also have an ombudsman, and that was also a very good and influential institution to protect human rights. I have checked the report of 2021 of the Ombudsman, and it seems that the agenda is now much more on social rights than on political and civil rights. I have seen in the 2021 report a section on rights of journalists during manifestations, and there were obviously over 100 arrests. And it's mentioned, and there is one case mentioned where a misunderstanding could be clarified then, but all the other, I think it was 127 cases, they remain somehow unsolved, and it's just mentioned, but it's not clear what is going to be done about it. So the Ombudsman institution still exists, but does not seem to be a really helpful pillar for civil society. And the Presidential Council for the Development of Civil Society and Human Rights, I understand that the main changes were concerning persons. So there were new persons, and with new persons, you have a new style and you have a new approach. And so there were a few statements, but only individual statements and not common statements of all of them concerning human rights. So there as well, it seems that this institution did not function as it functioned for quite a number of years before. So generally we can say what happened, there were new rules, formal and informal, concerning these institutions. There were new persons, and probably there were also new expectations how these institutions should function and what would be their role. And civil society was sitting in these institutions, but when people could not continue their work there, they could not do much about it. Now, the third point is the legislative activity, and there I would really say it was an activist legislative activity. So many laws were passed in this area, just incredible. And the laws passed were amended all the time. So I have checked that some of the laws that were adopted in the early 2000s, they have been changed about 20 times. So all the time, and always in the direction of being more repressive. Many of those laws have been criticized by international bodies, by the UN bodies, by all the different human rights bodies, but also by the more specific human rights bodies, by the Venice Commission, by the European Court of Human Rights. But whenever there was a new amendment, it was not in the direction that was indicated, but just in the opposite direction. What we can observe that all that is done on the basis of the law. So it's very transparent. You can read the laws, you can see the amendments, but at the same, so it seems that it's a very legal change, but at the same time, when you look more precisely at the law, you see that some of the notions used are very vague and very broad. So sometimes it's not really clear, or often it's not really clear how these laws will be interpreted. We know that in Russia, in early Russia, we had this tradition of legal nihilism. now we have some opposite of nihilism, because laws are being passed all the time, in just very many, changed all the time, and then they are applied very forcefully. So people are brought to justice on the basis of these laws. But nevertheless, these laws are vague and open. So it's not what would be the understanding of rule of law. So we can say that there is perhaps no more legal nihilism, but there is a human rights nihilism in these new laws. The main piece of legislation is for sure the foreign agent legislation from 2012. And it has changed its approach. In the beginning, it was just directed against money coming in from outside, labeling financial influence. And now I understand it's more going into the direction of prohibiting contact with ideas coming from outside. So it's gone a long way. And also in the beginning, it was building up quite bureaucratic hurdles and making it dangerous to continue with certain activities. But now it seems to me that the sanctions are so harsh that it's more or less an exclusion from Russian society for people who are active and who are classified as foreign agents. So this is not the only legislation. I don't have to go into the details. You know your legislation. I just mentioned them. We have a lot of what we call fake news legislation, the COVID legislation. We have the fake news legislation on the information on what's happening in Ukraine with the army. We have a lot of specific legislation there. We have the extremism legislation adopted in 2002, which was changed 19 times, and it's very unclear what's meant by extremism. We have also laws prescribing a certain memory policy. Actually, that was the topic here in Warsaw. And we have laws on terrorism, on secret state secrets, laws that other states have as well. The problem is not the law as such, but the way in which vague notions are used. We have the law on the propaganda for non-traditional sexual relations and the law on the protection of religious freedom. So all that concerns freedom of expression. We also have very restrictive manners concerning freedom of assembly. And it seems that assemblies, they were impossible during COVID, and these COVID regulations were upheld or are being upheld until now. I don't know if it has been changed now in the meantime. When I wrote my report, they were still upheld. But there was also announced an amendment of freedom of assembly, which would not allow it to be anywhere where people would be visible when they protest. So nevertheless, it was always this appearance of legality was always upheld. So the constitution was changed, and a lot of amendments were clearly mirroring these changes in society. And we had elections, we had referendums. So this appearance was always upheld, but from the outside, it's somehow the impression that it's a cynical approach to law, because law is not protecting citizens, but it's meant as a restrictive measure for civil society. So let me perhaps quote a little anecdote by Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka wrote a tiny little, piece. It's just half a page. And it's about a mouse that is going into corridors. And then the corridors are getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And the mouse gets afraid and says, where am I? The corridors are always narrower. And what can I do? And then it asks the cat. and the cat is behind the mouse, and the cat says, "Oh, no problem, you just have to change the orientation." And then the cat eats the mouse. So this is this little story by Kafka. And when I was analyzing all what has happened to the civil society, it seemed to be a little bit like this mouse, being always in a narrower and narrower situation, and not able, well, to follow this recommendation to turn around. So what could civil society have done? I've reflected a lot. I don't know. I understood that after these first laws in 2012, civil society continued to function, and to a certain extent, I understand that it still functions. It's a lot of courage. It's admirable, but yeah, it was not possible to change, to be effective, to avoid, to prevent these changes. Well, so then with that, we come to the international community and to the European society. What is the thought of the international community? What could they have done? We all know that we had this idea of the common European house already. I think it was even Gorbachev who started, and then Yeltsin who took the idea up, and it was then brought into the idea of accession to the Council of Europe. And there we had this, idea behind the whole the Council of Europe idea, which I may just summarize with this very famous statement by Henri Tejan, so one of the authors of the European Convention of Human Rights, from a French minister, and he explained what it meant, why the Council of Europe was set up in the 1950s, and what was the main idea. And of course, he drew on what had happened before 1945 in Germany. And so let me quote literally: "Democracies do not become Nazi countries in one day. Evil progresses cunningly, with a minority operating, as it were, to remove the levers of control. One by one, freedoms are suppressed in one sphere after another. Public opinion and the entire national conscience are asphyxiated. It is necessary to intervene before it is too late. A conscience must exist somewhere which will sound the alarm to the minds of a nation menaced by this progressive corruption, to warn them of the peril and to show them that they are progressing down along a road which leads far." So this was the very spirit, this idea. It all happens step by step, and we have to have this alarm clock. And that's also the quotation why the European Court of Human Rights was always called Conscience of Europe. This idea of the conscience, a conscience must exist somewhere. So we all had believed in this idea, and we thought that the European Convention of Human Rights and the court would be the alarm clock, and a deterioration of the situation would not be possible anymore. But now we see that Belarus is completely outside. It was always outside of the system, but at some moment it had some guest status, for example, in the Venice Commission. And Russia was a member. Russia was within the whole system for between 1998 and 2022. But this system, or our idea, has failed. We have to admit that we were perhaps naive, or we expected too much. It was not successful. So why and where are our mistakes? So sometimes I think we can clearly see that the reactions to what happened were too late or too weak. I think the law on foreign agents is quite a good example. the Venice Commission actually was very good. They wrote opinions immediately. They were clear. They were very clear in their warnings. But the court was much too slow. It took almost 10 years. And we all know that the judgment was published in June 2022, when Russia had already declared that it would not accept judgments of the court anymore. So there, I think we can identify mistakes, clear mistakes. We can also criticize that sometimes human rights diplomacy was too diplomatic, and always try to see only the better part of the story, and not to see reality enough. So I would see actually a big problem with what I would call double standards. I think there were double standards, and just to give you a concrete example, Article 46, paragraph 4, this procedure for enforcing the implementation of judgments that are not implemented, where the Committee of Ministers can ask the court to adopt a judgment if a judgment was enforced by a member state. This was applied to Azerbaijan in the case of Mammadov, but it was not applied to Russia. And I think that was a double standard, because Russia at that time had already a law making it clear that it would select judgments to be implemented and judgments not to be implemented. And that was unacceptable. But the court, the Committee of Ministers did not react to that. So I see this as a real problem. I also see, as I've already said, this mixture of diplomacy and law. It's also a problem, but it's also sort of, if you are not diplomatic, you will not achieve anything. And it's just that we see the limits of what law can do as an instrument for international politics. So if we had not made those mistakes, if we had not had at some points double standards, too much diplomacy, being too slow, would it have changed things? To be honest, I'm not sure. If we now look about the exclusion of Russia from from the Council of Europe, from the court system, exclusion from the Human Rights Council. We have special rapporteur, which will be appointed. But does it really change the situation? I don't know. But I don't want, on a Human Rights Day, to stop on a very pessimistic note, although I must admit I am very pessimistic. But I still want to say that it's not the end of history. It's going on, and we still, in my view, all what we have been doing over those years to build up a rule of law and democracy is not without any use. I think what is the main thing that we have achieved, that for a certain period of time, we had a common yardstick. We had the convention, the European Convention of Human Rights, and Council of Europe standards as a common yardstick. Now we have the rhetoric that we are completely divided, we have completely different values, but that's not true. For so many years, we did have a common yardstick. It was ratified, the convention was ratified by 47 countries, including Russia. We did have this common standard. And so, well, we have to accept the experiment on this basis has failed, but as all physicians and people in chemistry and whatever, when an experiment fails, we have to change the setting, the setup of the experiment, and we have to start again. And in this context, let me come back to the Peace Nobel Prize. I think it was good to give it to those three NGOs from those three countries. We have to reflect together which part of the setup we can change. And I think we have not to wait for a distant future to reflect on this change of the setup, what we can make better. But I think it's now already the time to analyze what went wrong, where were the misunderstandings, what could we have done better, and what should we especially do better in the future. And I think there is no point where it's not possible to reflect about where to go from here and how to improve what has not developed in a way that we hoped it would develop. Thank you so much for your attention.